Okay, so we're continuing our teaching on the beginning, the source, the fountainhead of the Great Rebellion. And we started with the Great Famine of the early 14th century, and now we're going to move into the Black Death, or the Black Plague. And as I said, we're just reading from Wikipedia, right? That's all we really need to do to get kind of an overview of what's going on with a few details sprinkled in there. And that's enough to get an idea of how it's related. We've already seen from the Great Famine video, the one before this, that it made reference to the Black Death and what happened there combined with the Great Famine undermining the authority in European society, and especially of the church, and that leading to the Reformation. But it leads to it out of humanism and the Renaissance. So we'll get to that next. I'm just going to read from Wikipedia as I did in the last one and comment as we go. The Black Death, also known as the pestilence, the great mortality, or the plague, was a bubonic plague, pandemic, occurring in Afro-Eurasia from 1346 to 1353. It is the most fatal pandemic recorded in human history, resulting in the deaths of up to 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa, peaking in Europe from 1347 to 1351. Bubonic plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, but it may also cause septicemic and pneumonic plagues. So pneumonic is like of the lungs, of the breathing, right? The Black Death was the beginning of the second plague pandemic. The plague created religious, social, and economic upheavals with profound effects on the course of European history. I would say the Black Plague may be the single most influential event in European history of all time. The Black Death's territorial origins are disputed. They don't know exactly where it came from. They also don't know how it was spread. So when you hear people talking about, well, it came out of Asia and it was spread by the fleas on rats, they don't know that. That's speculation. They really don't know that. They have no idea how the Black Plague spread. They don't know. It's complete speculation. All right, so let's keep going. The pandemic originated either in Central Asia or East Asia, but its first definitive appearance was in Crimea in 1347. From there, it was most likely carried by fleas living on the black rats that traveled on Genoese merchant ships, spreading throughout the Mediterranean basin and reaching Africa, Western Asia, and the rest of Europe via Constantinople, Sicily, and the Italian peninsula. Current evidence indicates that once it came on shore, the Black Death was in large part spread by human fleas, which cause pneumonic plague, and the person-to-person contact via aerosols, which pneumonic plague enables, thus explaining the very fast inland spread of the epidemic, which was faster than would be expected if the primary vector was rat fleas causing bubonic plague. So now, those of you who are watching this video who lived through this time when the video was made, you understand about pandemics because we've got the coronavirus, right? So a coronavirus. So this is hit the entire world. Well, supposedly, right? And we don't know how the coronavirus is spread. It's only speculation. And they say it's through the aerosol. Aerosol means like water vapors that come out of, like in the air, that are suspended in the air. That's aerosol. Liquid that's suspended in the air. In this case, they're referring to what comes out of your breath or your nose. Like when you breathe or you sneeze and you get some moisture coming out of the body that hangs in the air. Or the projectiles that shoot through the air. But the aerosol is mainly hanging in the air. All right? So, see, they say that it first traveled by the fleas on the rats, and then somehow it spread by the fleas on humans. Well, those are not the same fleas. So you'd have to prove that it could travel from rat fleas to human fleas. And was it the same disease? Because here it's saying it's the pneumonic plague that was spreading rather than the bubonic plague. So, see, they're not, I don't think they know. I really don't think they know. They're just speculating. And they have no idea about the connection between these vectors. The Black Death was a vector, by the way, in medical terms, is the way that some disease gets into a region or a population. Through what avenue, through what way? Is it, through rats, or is it through, what, right? Through chickens. The Black Death's territorial origins are disputed. We just went through that. Okay. The Black Death was the second disaster affecting Europe during the late Middle Ages, the first one being the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. So let's look at this. They say that the Black Plague started in 1347 in Crimea, okay? And the Great Famine, effectively, the brunt of it was over in 1317. That's only 30 years. That's one lifespan. 1317 to 1347 was 30 years. Okay? So someone who was born at the end of the Great Famine would just be about dying at the beginning of the Black Plague. They'd be considered old at 30 years old. Okay, so it's estimated to have killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population. In total, the plague may have reduced the world population from an estimated 475 million to 350 to 375 million in the 14th century. There were further outbreaks throughout the later Middle Ages, and with other contributing factors, it took until 1500 for the European population to regain the levels of 1300. It took 200 years for the European population to regain its levels that it lost. Outbreaks of the plague recurred at various locations around the world until the early 19th century. Okay, we still have bubonic plague in America, chiefly in the Rockies among rodents, like pack rats and things of this sort. So or squirrels. Occasionally you'll hear of a squirrel being found with bubonic plague. So it still exists. All right, so you can see what's going on. They say that 100 million people around the world were killed by the Black Plague. That's the estimate. All right, now it's hard to make that kind of an estimate, because back then they didn't have records like we have records, right? And what happened to the records? And who would be counting, right? And especially in civilizations where they don't even have records. So it's hard to estimate that. But let's say it's right. That's 100 million out of 475 million. That's more than 25% of the world's population was killed by this single pandemic. That's serious. And that's only in a matter of 7 years. I mean, it lasted longer. I mean, it went on longer. So let's go ahead and we're not going to look at the disease itself. Okay. This is interesting, though. Previous plague pandemics. Recent research has suggested plague first infected humans in Europe and Asia in the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age. Research in 2018 found evidence of Yersinia pestis, that's the Black Plague, in an ancient Swedish tomb. I heard of that before. So it wasn't just in 2018 that was discovered. Which may have been associated with the Neolithic decline around 3000 BC, in which European populations fell significantly. This may have been different from more modern types, with bubonic plague transmissible by fleas first known from Bronze Age remains near Samarra. The symptoms of bubonic plague are first attested in a fragment of Rufus of Ephesus preserved by Oribasius. These ancient medical authorities suggested bubonic plague had appeared in the Roman Empire before the reign of Trajan, 6 centuries before arriving at Pelusium in the reign of Justinian I. In 2013, researchers confirmed earlier speculation that the cause of the plague of Justinian, which was very famous, this is 541 to 542, with recurrences in 750. Wow, that's 200 years later. They confirmed earlier speculation that the cause of the plague of Justinian was this bubonic plague. This is known as the first plague pandemic. So when they say that the plague came from Central Asia and Eastern Asia, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. It's been sitting there in Europe since at least 750. And so when it hit in 1340, well, you can do the math. 600 years later. Okay, 600 years later. And this was 200 years between its first strike and its recurrence. That's 200 years between it. So what's 600 years? You know, to this, that they could strike 200 years later, and we know for sure that that was the same. Of course it could be from that also. So we'll have a look at that in a minute here. 14th century plague. Well, let's look at it now, all right? We'll come back to this. All right, so the plague of Justinian, all right, 541 to 549 was the beginning of the first plague pandemic, the first old world pandemic of plague, the contagious disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The disease afflicted the entire Mediterranean basin, Europe, and the Near East, severely affecting the Sasanian Empire and the Roman Empire, and especially its capital, Constantinople. The plague is named for the Roman emperor in Constantinople, Justinian I, who, according to his court historian Procopius, contracted the disease and recovered in 542. At the height of the epidemic, which killed about a fifth of the population of the imperial capital, that's Constantinople, 1/5 of the people died there from it, the contagion arrived in Roman Egypt in 541, spread around the Mediterranean Sea until 544, and persisted in northern Europe and the Arabian Peninsula until 549. In 2013, researchers confirmed earlier speculation that the cause of the plague of Justinian was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death. The latter was much shorter, but still killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europeans. Ancient and modern Yersinia pestis strains closely related to the ancestors of the Justinian plague strain have been found in Tian Shan, a system of mountain ranges on the borders of Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and China, suggesting that the Justinian plague originated in or near that region. Okay, just because you find the same bacteria or an ancestor of the bacteria in another part of the world doesn't mean it came from that part of the world. It doesn't mean that. These are the mistakes that they make in these speculations. It doesn't mean that. It might be, but it doesn't mean that. As if that's the only place in the world that bacteria ever, occurred, ever was created. No, I don't believe that. So the plague of Justinian is the first and best known outbreak of the first plague pandemic, which continued to recur until the middle of the 8th century. Some historians believe the first plague pandemic was one of the deadliest pandemics in history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 50 to 100 million people during 2 centuries of recurrence, a death toll equivalent to 25 to 60% of Europe's population at the time of the first outbreak. The plague's social and cultural impact has been compared to that of the Black Death, the second plague pandemic, that devastated Eurasia in the 14th century. Research published in 2019 argued that the 200-year-long pandemic's death toll and social effects have been exaggerated, comparing it to the modern third plague pandemic, 1855 to 1960s. Research published in 2019 argued that the 200-year-long pandemic's death toll and social effects have been exaggerated. So they're saying that it didn't kill as many people as they're claiming to have killed. This again is that jaded skepticism of science, modern science especially. Oh, no, it couldn't have been that bad. No, you're exaggerating things. No, it couldn't. No, it couldn't be. No. Yep. There it is again, creeping its ugly head up again. Okay, but you can see that you can see that these plagues really had to have undermined the authority of the church. The first one, maybe not. But definitely by the time you get to the second one, if there's any memory of the first one passed on to people and the second one hits, they're going to give up. I mean, you're allowed one mistake on that scale. But 2 mistakes on that scale where God doesn't hear you, there's something definitely wrong at the root of the church. And hence the Protestant Reformation. Doesn't mean the Protestant Reformation was right or the men who led it had stopped sinning and were righteous. I'm not saying that. In fact, I highly doubt that. All right, let's go back to the Black Death then. Okay. There are no exact figures for the death toll. The rate varied widely by locality. In urban centers, the greater the population before the outbreak, the longer the duration of the period of abnormal mortality. So the more people you had before the outbreak, the more people you had in that city, in that concentrated area, the longer the death rate was so severe. That severe death rate lasted much longer. Well, of course, there's a greater population, and they're more densely packed in. It killed some 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia. The mortality rate of the Black Death in the 14th century was far greater than the worst 20th century outbreaks of Y. pestis plague, which occurred in India and killed as much as 3% of the population of certain cities. The overwhelming number of... So understand that they're saying that in the 20th century, there were outbreaks of this same plague in India that killed 3% of the people in some cities. The overwhelming number of deceased bodies produced by the Black Death caused the necessity of mass burial sites in Europe, sometimes including up to several hundred or several thousand skeletons. The mass burial sites that have been excavated have allowed archaeologists to continue interpreting and defining the biological, sociological, historical, and anthropological implications of the Black Death. Okay? According to the medieval historian Philip Dylier, it is likely that over 4 years, 45 to 50% of European population died of the plague. In 4 years. Now, we've only gotten into this plague by 1 year. And it's pretty bad. Norwegian historian Ole Benediktov suggests it could have been as much as 60% of the European population. In 1348, the disease spread so rapidly that before any physicians or government authorities had time to reflect upon its origins, about a third of the European population had already perished in crowded cities. It was not uncommon for as much as 50% of the population to die. Half of Paris's population of 100,000 people died. In Italy, the population of Florence was reduced from between 110,000 and 120,000 inhabitants in 1338 down to 50,000 in 1351. So that's 13 years. At least 60% of the population of Hamburg and Bremen perished, and a similar percentage of Londoners may have died from the disease as well, with a death toll of approximately 62,000 between 1346 and 1353. That's 7 years. Florence's tax records suggest that 80% of the city's population died within 4 months in 1348. Let me make sure I'm reading this right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Florence, I mean, they have a record there based on taxes of 4 months. They lost 80% of the population. Before 1350, there were about 170,000 settlements in Germany, and this was reduced by nearly 40,000 by 1450. So that means they lost 40,000 settlements where the people died. The disease bypassed some areas, with the most isolated areas being less vulnerable to contagion. Plague did not appear in Douai in Flanders until the turn of the 15th century. And the impact was less severe on the populations of Hainaut, Finland, northern Germany, and areas of Poland. Monks, nuns, and priests were especially hard hit since they cared for victims of the Black Death. So, all right, this plays into it as well then. Is that if people saw that monks, nuns, and priests who were servants of God were going in and caring for the ill, and they were dying, that had to absolutely undermine the authority of the church. People's confidence that God would listen to the clergy, to the monks, to the nuns, to the priests, to the bishops, to the cardinals, to the pope. Because you had their own people in there ministering to the ill and dying. Where was God protecting them? They were doing God's work for the ill, for the weak, for the suffering, and God allowed them to die. You're getting a good picture of it, I hope, of how this undermined the authority of Christianity, and especially the Roman Catholic Church. The physician to the Avignon papacy observed the decreasing mortality rate of successive outbreaks of plague in 1347 to 48, 1362, 71, 82, in his 1382 treatise on epidemics. Now understand what he's saying is that with each outbreak of it, the mortality rate was less. That means there were fewer people dying. More people were living, right? There weren't as many people dying from it with each time that it hit. In the first outbreak, 2/3 of the population contracted the illness and most patients died. In the next, half the population became ill, but only some died. By the third, 1/10 were affected and many survived. While by the fourth occurrence, only 1 in 20 people were sickened and most of them survived. So there was some sort of, herd immunity being developed. By the 1380s in Europe, it predominantly affected children. And this guy here, I won't pronounce his name, Venario, I guess, recognized that bloodletting was ineffective, though he continued to prescribe bleeding for members of the Roman Curia, whom he disliked. Okay. Bloodletting is to use leeches and to suck out the blood that supposedly is supposed to get enough of that foreign organism out of the blood, and then the body will, restore the blood with fresh blood. But you're trying to get that organism that's living in the blood out of it by bloodletting. So there is something to that. And actually we started bloodletting again in modern times here. And claimed that all true cases of plague were caused by astrological factors and were incurable. He himself was never able to effect a cure. So he claimed that it was astrology that was causing the plague. There's it was in the stars, right? So, right? The most widely accepted estimate for the Middle East, including Iraq, Iran, and Syria during this time, is for a death toll of about 1/3 of the population. Understand though, when you hear 1/3, you think, a third. No, it's 1 out of 3 people died. Out of every person you know, if you divide them into 3 people groups, 1 person out of every one of those groups dies. That's what we're talking about. The Black Death killed about 40% of Egypt's population. Wow. That's almost 1 out of 2. In Cairo, with a population numbering as many as 600,000 and possibly the largest city west of China, between 1/3 and 40% of the inhabitants died inside of 8 months. In 8 months, that's less time than we've had the coronavirus. If you had 1/3, 33 to 40% of people in your city die in this amount of time. That's what we're talking about. It's massive. Italian chronicler Agnolo di Tura recorded his experience from Siena, where plague arrived in May 1348. Father abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died. Not just the breath. It says through the breath and sight. How does a plague strike through sight? I understand breath, but how does it strike through sight? And yet he believed it struck through sight in some cases. And so they died. So again, I'm saying we don't know how this spread, whatever it was that was being spread. We don't even know what it was. They name a bacterium, and yet they talk about two different kinds of plagues. Maybe it's the same bacterium, affecting the organism in different ways. I don't know. And so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. You couldn't pay someone or appeal to them being the friend of the person who died. They wouldn't bury the dead. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. Great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds both day and night, and as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo Ditura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. Now imagine, those dogs must have become infected and spread the disease. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. This is important. And when I read this account by him, that's where God opened my eyes to the role of the Black Plague. There was no hope left. People were waiting to die. There were no ceremonies by the priests over the dead bodies, over the souls. They were buried, and that was it. And no one wept. Some people weren't buried because there was no one to bury them. You couldn't even pay someone to bury them because they didn't even want to get near one of the dead bodies, because people were dying day and night across the cities and in the countryside. Day and night, massive amounts of people were dying in the daytime. At night they'd die. Next day they'd die. The next night they'd die. No one was going near those bodies. It was hard to get anyone to go near the bodies to bury them. Yet they had to bury them, because if they didn't, they'd lie in the street, and then other diseases would be spread. And they gave up hope. They quit weeping over the dead because they themselves expected to follow them soon. And everyone thought that was the end of the world. And I would too if I were in it. If 1 out of 2 people all around you were dying, why would you not think it was the end of the world? You absolutely would. No one would be immune from that. You would think it was the end of the world, whether you thought that it was by God's hand or by natural catastrophe. You would think it was the end of the world. There's absolutely no one who would hold up under that and not think it was the end of the world. We'll continue this in the next video. Remember to subscribe down below and like the video and share it on your Facebook and other social media. And then make a comment, whether a question or a comment. We read all of them, and we try to respond to all. Get on over to our website, The Rooted Word, and start reading the translation and also the articles that we've posted. It's at therootedword.com, therootedword.com. And may the Lord bless you as you seek Him with all your heart.